Meridian Cole, The Last Hunter, a story of darkness, duty, and the things that outlive the light, a story of darkness, duty, and the things that outlive the light. Chapter 1. The cold country. The air up here in the high country didn't just sit in your lungs. It bit at them. It was a bitter, thin soup of old pine needles, frozen granite, and the wet, heavy promise of snow that had been loitering just over the jagged peaks of the bitter range for 3 days now. Meridian Cole pulled the reins of his bay mare, a sturdy beast named Duchess, who didn't mind the cold half as much as he did. The saddle leather groaned under him, a familiar, comforting sound that spoke of miles traveled and roads that led nowhere good. He adjusted the weight of his pack, feeling the cold steel of the various instruments of his trade pressing through the canvas. It was a weight he'd carried since he was big enough to hold a blade, a burden that felt less like equipment and more like a second skeleton. Montana was a big state full of big silences, but this valley felt different. It felt like a place where the map makers had simply given up, leaving the paper blank and white. The road beneath Duchess's hooves was little more than a memory of a trail, choked with scree and the skeletal remains of winterkill. Cole looked up at the mountains. They stood like a gray wall, indifferent to the laws of men, the statutes of God, or the petty grievances of the things that crawled beneath them. Out here, the law was whatever you could hold in your hand, and whatever you could live with when the sun went down. At the entrance to the settlement, a man stood beside a pile of weathered boulders that might have once been a gatehouse. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a heavy flannel shirt the color of dried blood and buckskin trousers that had seen better decades. He held a rifle across his lap with the easy familiarity of a man who used it more often than his fork. When Cole approached, the man didn't stand. He just looked up, his eyes deep and dark, like water at the bottom of a very old well. There was a tiredness there that didn't come from a lack of sleep. It was the weariness of someone who had seen the moon change too many times and knew exactly what that change entailed. Cole gave a short, sharp flick of his chin, not a greeting but an acknowledgement. The sentinel nodded back, a slow, heavy movement, and gestured with the barrel of his rifle toward the cluster of cabins below. As he rode in, Cole felt the familiar low-grade fever starting to cook in his marrow. It was the itch in his palms, the way his blood began to hum like a high-tension wire in a windstorm. The gift, or the curse, depending on how much bourbon he'd had the night before. His grandfather had hunted things in the black, sucking bogs of the old country, places where the mud remembered the taste of Roman legionaries. His father had chased shadows through the endless white blindness of the Siberian taiga, where the wind sounded like the screaming of ghosts. Now Meridian Cole was here, the last of a line that had spent centuries pruning the darker branches of the world's family tree. His blood was a compass, and right now it was pointing straight toward the heart of this quiet, huddling village. Chapter 2. The settlement looked ordinary enough to a casual observer, the kind of place you'd find on a postcard if the photographer were colorblind and depressed. There was the smell of wood smoke, sharp and sweet, the rhythmic thud of an axe meeting a log, the distant, low lowing of cattle. In one of the yards, a woman was hanging laundry, her movements rhythmic and certain. But if you looked closer, the way Cole was trained to look, the ordinary started to peel away. The people here didn't walk. They moved with a concentrated animal grace, a fluidity hidden beneath the rough wool of their work shirts. Their shoulders were too broad, their gazes too steady, and there was a stillness to them that was entirely unhuman. They were people who knew their true nature, and they wore it like a heavy coat they couldn't take off. He was directed to a cabin at the far end of the village, a structure of heavy hand-hewn logs that smelled of dried herbs and old oiled leather. Inside, the heat from the hearth was almost physical, a thick blanket of warmth that carried the scent of sage and something metallic. An old man sat by the fire, his face a map of every hard winter he'd ever survived. His skin was the color of a well-worn baseball glove, creased and tough. This was the head of the community, a man who had seen the pact signed in blood and watched the years of peace slowly erode. The old man didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke of the mountains, of the deep, lightless veins of the earth where things had slept for 1,000 years. He spoke of the entity that had crawled out of that darkness, a creature of old hunger and older malice. They didn't say its name. They didn't have to. The word hung in the air like the smell of a house that had been closed up for a century. Manticore. It had woken up hungry, and it was intelligent. It knew the rhythm of the village. It knew that during the month these people were merely stronger than average men. But when the moon reached its full silver height, they became something more, and that was when the creature became a ghost, melting into the shadows, waiting for the strength to fade so it could resume its harvest. Cole listened, his fingers tracing the hilt of the knife at his belt. The air in the room felt heavy, saturated with a dread that was almost tangible. Outside, the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. The creature was out there watching, waiting for the light to die. Cole could feel it in his veins, a sharp, pulsing heat. He was the blade they had decided to draw, the necessary evil brought in to deal with a greater one. He looked at the old man and saw the desperation behind the stoicism. They were out of options, and the winter was coming fast. Chapter 3. The woman called Roja. By the time Cole stepped back out into the cooling air, the village had begun to settle into the uneasy crouch of a town under siege. The sun was gone now, replaced by a sky the color of a fresh bruise, purple and deep. Lights flickered to life in small, square windows. Not the warm, inviting glow of a happy home, but the defensive yellow of eyes watching the dark. He made his way toward a communal fire pit where the younger men and women gathered. It was there he first saw her. She was standing near the flames, the orange light dancing across a face that was all sharp angles and restless energy. Her hair was a tangled mane of dark chestnut, and her eyes, when they caught the light, glowed with a fierce amber intensity. She was laughing at something a tall man next to her had said, a sound that felt startlingly alive in a place so choked with apprehension. She wasn't just another member of the pack. She was a pulse of raw vitality, a woman who hadn't yet let the shadow of the mountain extinguish her spirit. "That's Roja," a voice said near his elbow. It was the sentinel from the gate, his rifle still tucked under his arm. "She's got more fire than a heater in a drafty barn, and she's the best tracker we've got. If you're going up there, you'll need her. The rest of us, well, we're mostly just muscle and hair." Cole didn't answer. He watched her for a moment longer, noting the way she stood, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet, ready for a spring. She sensed his gaze and turned, her laughter dying away like a flame cut off from oxygen. She didn't look away. Most people flinched when Cole looked at them. There was something in his eyes, something cold and clinical, that made them feel like specimens on a board. But Roja just tilted her head, her amber eyes narrowing as if she were trying to solve a particularly difficult riddle. The plan was hashed out in a small barn that smelled of dry hay and ancient grease. There would be 5 of them: Cole, Roja, and 3 others who looked like they could wrestle a bear and win. They had 7 days, 7 cycles of the sun, until the moon bloated into a full silver coin, and the villagers lost the edge of their control. The strategy was as old as hunting itself. Use a lure to draw the beast into a killing bottle. The manticore was arrogant. It considered this valley its larder and the people in it its livestock. They would give it a reason to come down, a reason to think it was hunting, while Cole waited in the dark with a cold heart and a sharp edge. Chapter 4. Sharpening the blade. Cole spent the next morning preparing his gear. He sat on a stump outside his designated cabin, a whetstone in one hand and a long, heavy blade of meteoric iron in the other. The metal had a dull gray sheen, and when he ran stone along the edge, it didn't scream. It made a low, rhythmic sound like a heartbeat. He worked with a slow, methodical precision, his hands moving with a memory that predated his own birth. The air around him smelled of gun oil and the sharp, pungent tang of a garlican silver nitrate solution he used to coat his bolts. These were the smells of his life, the chemicals of the trade, the incense of the hunt. The manticore, he knew, wouldn't smell like wood smoke or pine. It would smell like old copper pennies left out in the rain, mixed with the sweet, cloying stench of something that had died in the walls of a house and been forgotten. That smell had already started to creep into his dreams, a foul metallic vapor that left a bitter taste on the back of his tongue. He looked up and saw Roja walking toward him, her stride long and confident. She was wearing a heavy leather jacket and boots that looked like they'd seen 500 miles of hard trail. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" she asked, stopping a few feet away. She didn't wait for an answer. She reached out and touched the hilt of the sword resting across his knees. Her fingers were calloused, the nails short and clean. "You smell like loneliness, Hunter. It's a dry smell like dust in an attic." Cole paused his sharpening, the silence between them stretching out until it became a physical thing. He didn't take offense. He didn't have the energy for it. "Loneliness keeps you sharp," he said, his voice sounding like gravel being turned over by a spade. "Friends make you slow, and slow gets you ended." Roja laughed, though there was no humor in it this time. "We're werewolves, Cole. We don't do anything alone. Even our ghosts travel in packs." She leaned closer and he could feel the heat radiating off her, a staggering, predatory warmth that made the 40-degree air feel like a summer breeze. "But I reckon you're different. You're the man who walks between the worlds. Just don't get lost in the middle." She turned and walked away, leaving him with the smell of wild mint and the lingering heat of her presence. And for a second, the itch in his palms felt almost like a caress. Chapter 5. Into the high country they left the settlement at dawn, a time when the world was a study in shades of charcoal and ash. A thick white fog had rolled down from the peaks during the night, settling over the valley floor like a burial shroud. It was the kind of mist that muffled sound and played tricks on the eyes, turning a stunted pine into a crouching man and a jagged rock into a waiting beast. Duchess was back in the village. The mountain trails were no place for a horse once you got into the high scree. Cole led the way, his boots finding the path with an instinct he didn't bother to question. The forest didn't welcome them. It felt as if the trees were leaning in, their branches like long, skeletal fingers reaching out to pluck at their clothes. The silence was absolute, the kind that rings in your ears. There were no birds calling, no squirrels chattering in the brush. Even the wind seemed to have lost its voice, failing to stir the needles of the ancient, towering firs. It was an expectant silence, the breath held before a scream. Cole could hear the 4 hearts beating behind him, 4 distinct rhythms, each one a little faster than it should be. They had been climbing for 3 hours when Roja, who was ranging slightly to the left, came to a halt. She didn't call out. Noise was a luxury they couldn't afford, but she raised a hand, palm flat. Cole moved toward her, his feet making no more sound than a ghost on carpet. She pointed to the trunk of a massive cedar. About 10 feet up, the bark had been shredded. Long vertical furrows torn into the wood as if by a giant's comb. The edges of the wounds were weeping a thick black sap that didn't look like ordinary resin. Cole reached out and touched the edge of one of the gouges. His fingertips went numb almost. Instantly, a cold, tingling sensation that raced up his arm and settled in his elbow. He pulled back, rubbing his hand against his thigh. "Poison," he whispered, his voice barely a vibration in the air. "The tail barbs, it's marking its territory." He looked up at the height of the scratches. The creature was even larger than the old man's stories had suggested. It wasn't just a monster. It was a siege engine made of muscle and malice. Roja was different out here. In the village, she had been a woman. Here she was a predator. Her movements had become fluid, almost oily as she glided over the uneven ground. Her nostrils flared constantly, sampling the air, filtering out the scent of damp earth and rotting wood to find the one thing that didn't belong. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion, her eyes never staying in one place for more than a second. Cole found himself watching her, admiring the sheer, brutal efficiency of her nature. She was a living weapon, and she was beginning to unsheathe. Chapter 6. The Trap and the Terrible Truth. The clearing was a natural amphitheater, a flat expanse of silver-gray grass surrounded by a jagged crown of granite outcroppings. It sat on a high shoulder of the mountain, looking out over a sea of black timber that stretched away into the darkness. The moon was a heavy, bloated thing, not yet full, but pregnant with light, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe on the ground. This was the place. It was a killing floor, open and exposed, the kind of spot where a predator would feel most confident. Roja walked to the center of the clearing. She moved with a deliberate, slow grace, her silhouette sharp against the moon-washed grass. Without a word, she shed her leather jacket, then her heavy wool overshirt, leaving her in a thin, sleeveless undershirt that clung to her skin. Her shoulders were pale, almost luminous in the twilight. Cole, watching from a crevice between two massive boulders 30 yards away, could see her shivering. It wasn't from the cold, though the temperature was dropping toward freezing. It was the vibration of her own internal engine, the wolf inside her sensing the proximity of the kill and straining at the leash. "I'm ready," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the clearing. She wasn't talking to him, but to the mountain itself. Cole adjusted his position, his body blending into the gray-black of the granite. He felt like a part of the rock, cold and unmoving. His palms were sweating despite the chill, and the heat in his veins was now a roar, a white noise frequency that made his teeth ache. He had his heavy crossbow braced on a flat ledge, a bolt tipped with a mixture of phosphorus and iron-glass ready in the groove. Beside it lay his sword. Minutes bled into hours. Time in a hunt isn't linear. It's a viscous, stretching thing that threatens to stall entirely. Then the air changed. A smell drifted into the clearing, not the scent of the forest, but something ancient and foul. It was the smell of a copper plate factory that had been turned into a slaughterhouse. And along with the smell came a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of static electricity that made the fine hairs on Cole's neck stand up. The manticore didn't enter the clearing. It didn't roar. It simply was. One moment the edge of the trees was empty, and the next a shadow had detached itself from the timber. It was massive, the size of a grizzly, but with the lean, corded muscle of a lion. Its fur was a sickly mottled orange red like rusted iron. But it was the face that made Cole's heart skip a beat, a human face, or a horrific parody of one, with pale, stretched skin and 3 rows of needle-sharp teeth that glinted like wet bone. It didn't charge. It prowled along the perimeter, its heavy paws making no sound on the grass. Its tail, a long, segmented whip, tipped with a cluster of black, glistening barbs, rose and fell behind it like a cobra preparing to strike. It was watching Roja, its pale eyes reflecting the moonlight with a cold, intelligent hunger. Cole held his breath, his finger ghosting over the trigger of the crossbow. Something was wrong. The beast wasn't acting like a hungry animal. It was acting like a general. It was circling, looking not at the bait but past it. It knew. The realization hit Cole like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just a hunter. It was a tactician, and they had just stepped into its trap. The explosion of violence was so sudden it felt like a rift in reality. One of the men stationed in the rocks to Cole's right let out a sound, not a scream, but a wet, choked gurgle that ended before it truly began. The manticore hadn't attacked Roja. It had ignored the bait entirely and struck at the perimeter, moving with a speed that defied its massive bulk. "Break! Break!" Cole roared, his voice shattering the silence of the mountain like a hammer through glass. The clearing dissolved into madness. Cole abandoned the crossbow, too slow for this close-quarters butchery, and surged out of his hiding spot, his sword clearing its scabbard with a hiss. The metal felt alive in his hand, a cold extension of his own righteous fury. The battle was ferocious and brief and catastrophic. When the manticore finally turned and bounded toward the tree line, the clearing was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a tomb. 3 men were gone. Their stories ended in the dirt of a Montana mountain, and the manticore was still out there, wounded, enraged, and now fully aware of the threat Meridian Cole posed. They had come to hunt a monster, and instead they had been taught a lesson in the architecture of fear. Chapter 7. The weight of what we carry. The atmosphere in the village when they returned was like a funeral held in a thunderstorm. There was no weeping. Not yet, just a grim, silent resolve that felt more dangerous than any outburst of grief. Cole sat on the steps of the infirmary, his hands stained with a dark residue that wouldn't wash off. He felt the weight of the failure pressing down on him. He had been hired to be the shield, and the shield had shattered. "They're saying you didn't do enough," Roja said, stepping out of the shadows. She was dressed now in a fresh shirt and jeans, but she looked diminished, her amber eyes clouded, the fire he'd seen before reduced to a smoldering coal. She sat down beside him, her thigh pressing against his, a heat that felt like a rebuke. "I don't care what they say," Cole replied, his voice flat. "The group is an encumbrance. It makes too much noise, has too many hearts, and it thinks too much. The manticore used our numbers against us. It won't happen again." "What are you saying?" I'm saying I'm going back up there alone. It's wounded. I can track the blood and the toxin. I'll finish this or I'll end my path on that mountain. But I won't lead any more of your people into a meat grinder. He stood, intending to head for his cabin to restock, but Roja caught his arm. Her grip was like a vice, the strength of the wolf still humming just beneath her skin. You're not going alone, Hunter. You don't know the high passes. You don't know the way the wind shifts in the canyons or where the old mines are. You'll wander into a blind alley and it'll have your head for breakfast. Her eyes flashed with something ferocious and honest. I have a debt to settle. And I'm not letting a man who smells like an old library be the one to pay it. We go together, or I'll track you and find you anyway. Your choice. Chapter 8. The bridge between WRLDS they left at midnight, slipping out of the village like shadows. No horses, no pack of guards, just the two of them and the cold, indifferent stars. For 3 days they climbed. The trail of the manticore was easy for Cole to follow, not with his eyes but with his blood. The creature's malice had a physical presence, a shriveled, blackened trail through the forest. Where it had passed, the grass had withered and the saplings had curled as if scorched by an invisible fire. It was a trail of suffering made tangible, and it led deeper into the jagged heart of the range. The higher they went, the more they spoke. In the quiet moments by a tiny shielded fire, the barriers between them began to erode. Roja talked about the burden of the change, the way the moon felt like a hook in her gut, pulling her toward a wildness that threatened to swallow her humanity whole. She spoke of the fear that one day she wouldn't come back from the woods, that the woman named Roja would simply cease to be, replaced by a gray ghost with no memory of love or laughter. Cole listened, and was surprised by the words that found their way out of his own mouth. He told her about the long, dusty roads of his life, the small towns with names he'd forgotten, the endless cycle of death and duty. He'd never had a home, never had a reason to stay in one place longer than it took to bury the monster. With her, the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge. He found himself noticing the way the moonlight caught the curve of her jaw, the way her scent had changed from wild mint to something deeper, muskier, and more intoxicating as the full moon approached. "You're a strange man, Cole," she whispered on the third night, her hand ghosting over his as they sat in the lee of a wind-blasted ridge. "You spend your whole life killing monsters, but you've got more of the dark in you than most of them. It's like you're trying to kill the part of yourself you don't like by finding it in the woods." He didn't pull his hand away. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I'm just good at it. Some men are born to build houses. Some are born to burn them down. I'm just the guy who cleans up the ashes." She didn't answer, but she didn't let go of his hand either. In that moment, with the temperature at 10 degrees and the wind howling like a banshee, Meridian Cole felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. A flicker of heat that had nothing to do with the hunt and everything to do with the woman beside him. It was a dangerous feeling, a distraction he couldn't afford. But as he watched her sleep an hour later, he knew he was already lost. Chapter 9. The Devil's Throat. The fourth day was a grueling climb through a landscape that seemed to be actively trying to kill them. They were above the tree line now, in a world of gray scree and treacherous ice. The air was so thin it felt like breathing through a wet cloth, and every step was a battle against gravity. The manticore's scent was overwhelming now, a thick, oily pall of decay that clung to the back of Cole's throat. The creature was close. It had stopped running and was now circling its trail, a series of tightening loops around a deep, jagged canyon known as the Devil's Throat. They reached the edge of the canyon at midday. Its walls were a chaotic jumble of limestone boulders and ancient twisted pines that managed to cling to the precipice. At the bottom, 500 feet down, a glacier-fed stream roared over black rocks. The smell of death here was a physical wall, a rotting, stagnant stench that spoke of 1,000 years of accumulated carnage. This was the manticore's larder. Roja was changing. The moon was only 2 nights away from its peak, and the wolf was beginning to dominate her features. Her movements had become jagged, twitchy. She didn't walk anymore, she prowled, her head low, her nostrils constantly working. She had stopped talking. The woman Cole had shared a fire with was retreating, replaced by a creature of pure instinct. It pained him to see it, a slow erasure of the person he had come to care for. but he knew they needed that wildness if they were to survive. Halfway down the descent into the canyon, they found the first nest, a hollowed-out space beneath a massive overhang. Lined with the shredded remains of clothing, hair, and bones. The malice here was so thick it felt like walking through deep water. Cole looked at Roja and saw her hackles rise, a literal ridge of hair standing up along her spine. "It knows we're here," she hissed, her voice a guttural rasp that was barely human. "I know," Cole replied. He could feel it. The manticore wasn't just nearby. It was closing the distance. The attack came from above, a blurring mass of mottled fur and hate that dropped from a ledge 30 feet up. Cole barely had time to roll to the side, the wind of the creature's passage whistling past his ear. What followed was a battle that defied description, a savage, screaming collision of hunter and monster in the half-dark of the canyon. Cole drove his meteoric iron into the creature's flank. Roja, transformed mid-stride into a gray-black fury of fur and fang, hit the manticore's flank like a freight train. The canyon filled with the smell of sulfur and copper, and the rank, wet dog scent of the changing. The manticore was stronger, but Cole found his opening. As the beast reared back to strike at Roja, he lunged forward and brought his blade down on the base of its segmented tail with every ounce of his family's ancient, bloody history behind the blow. The meteoric iron sheared through the joints, severing the poison-tipped barb. The tail fell to the ground, twitching like a dying snake. The manticore let out a shriek of such pure agony that Cole's knees buckled. Then his blood sense exploded with a new warning. Chapter 10. The dynasty. He looked toward the back of the canyon, toward a dark fissure in the rock he hadn't noticed before. A second manticore emerged from the shadows. Smaller, leaner, its fur a brighter and more vibrant orange. Not an adult, but nearly grown, a juvenile that had been hidden in the nursery while the mother hunted. It didn't roar. It just looked at the scene of the slaughter, its pale eyes fixing on Cole's back. He realized then the magnitude of his mistake. They hadn't been hunting a solitary monster. They had stumbled into a dynasty. The young manticore moved with a terrifying fluid grace that made the mother look clumsy. It launched itself across the canyon floor, a ginger streak of death, and hit Cole from behind, pinning him into the dirt, its claws sinking into his back like needles of ice. "Roja," he managed to gasp, his face pressed into the cold, sharp gravel. The elder manticore, sensing the arrival of its offspring, found a new reservoir of strength. It threw Roja off and lunged toward Cole, its one good eye fixed on his throat. It wanted the kill. It wanted the heart of the man who had dared to wound it. Cole watched it approach, a slow-motion nightmare of mottled fur and teeth. He was pinned. His sword was 10 feet away and his strength was flagging. This was it. The end of the road. The last hunter of his line, ending his path in a nameless canyon in Montana. Roja saw it. She was 20 feet away, her flank a mess of blood, her breathing a ragged, whistling sound. She looked at Cole, and for a fleeting, impossible second, the wolf receded. The amber eyes softened, and the woman, Roja, looked back at him. It was a look of profound, agonizing clarity. She knew what had to be done. She knew the math of the moment, and she chose the only answer that mattered. She didn't growl. She didn't snarl. She simply launched herself. It was a leap that defied physics, a gray arc through the twilight. She didn't hit the youngster. She hit the mother, throwing her entire weight between the beast and the man she had come to love. The elder manticore's claws tore through Roja's chest with a sickening, wet finality. The sound of her ribs breaking was a dry report that seemed to echo forever in the canyon walls. She didn't scream. She just took the blow. Her body, a shield of fur and courage. The shock of the sacrifice gave Cole the second he needed. He rolled, ignoring the agony in his shattered shoulder, and his hand found the hilt of his sword. He drove the meteoric iron through the elder manticore's open mouth, the blade shearing through soft palate and into brain. The beast shuddered once, with a long, violent convulsion, and then went still. The youngster let out a thin, high wail, a sound of genuine grief that was almost human. It looked at its dead mother, then at the man standing over her with a blood-stained blade. It saw the cold, abyssal void in the hunter's eyes. And despite its hunger, it chose survival over vengeance and vanished into the shadows of the rocks. Cole was too broken to follow. Chapter 11. What the moon sees, he dropped his sword and crawled toward the tangled mass of fur and blood. He pushed the manticore's heavy limb aside, his breath coming in jagged sobs. Roja lay there, her chest a ruined landscape. Her eyes were open, the amber fading to a dull, clouded gray. She was still breathing, but it was the shallow, bubbly respiration of someone whose time was measured in minutes. "Roja," he whispered, his voice cracking. Why did you do it?" She didn't answer with words. She couldn't. But her hand, cold and stained with black ichor, reached out and touched his cheek. Cole spent the next hours doing the impossible, carrying her up 500 feet of canyon wall on a crude travois fashioned from cedar boughs and his own leather gear, his fractured collarbone sending white-hot needles through his brain with every step. He would not leave her in that pit. The journey back through the high passes was a feat of endurance he would never remember clearly. He moved like a ghost, his feet finding the path by some ancient tectonic memory. He talked to her as he walked, his voice a low, steady drone against the roar of the mountain wind. He told her about the ocean, the vast salt-smelling emptiness of the Atlantic that his grandfather had crossed. He told her about the way the light hit the skyscrapers in New York City, turning them into pillars of gold. He told her about places where the woods were just woods, and the only things that went bump in the night were raccoons and the wind. He gave her a world she had never seen, a world without the hook of the moon or the shadow of the beast. As they reached the tree line, the full moon crested the ridge. It was a massive silver eye, casting a light so bright it felt like noon. Cole felt Roja stir. He stopped, kneeling beside the litter, pulling her into his lap, his body shielding her from the biting wind. She opened her eyes. Even under the crushing weight of the full moon's silver eye, which should have bound her to the beast, her human heart clawed its way to the surface for one final breath. The wolf retreated, not out of weakness but out of respect for the woman's final wish. The amber was gone. Her eyes were brown now, a deep, warm brown that reminded him of the earth after a spring rain. "I was happy to walk with you," she whispered. The words were so faint they were almost lost to the wind. Her fingers, which had been clutching his shirt, slowly relaxed. They slid down his arm, a soft, final caress, and then they were still. She met her fate just as the silver light reached the floor of the forest. There was no struggle, no final gasp. The light just went out of her, leaving behind a shell that was beautiful and tragic and entirely empty. Cole didn't move for a long time. He had spent his life ending monsters, but he had never learned how to save the things that mattered. He didn't cry, his eyes were as dry as the Montana dust, but he felt something inside him snap, a final cord that had held him to the rest of humanity. He tightened his grip on her, pressing his face into her hair, which still smelled of wild mint in the cold, clean air of the high country. The forest was silent. The predators were gone. The hunt was over. But for Meridian Cole, the real darkness was only just beginning. Chapter 12. The Road. That leads away, the sun was just beginning to bleed over the eastern horizon when Cole walked into the settlement. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a statue carved from the mountain itself, covered in dust, dried blood, and the gray ash of a burnt-out soul. The village was already awake, the people standing in small, silent groups. They didn't need to be told. They saw the way he carried her, and they saw the empty, haunted look in his eyes. He walked to the center of the village and laid her on the wooden platform in front of the elder's house. The old man stepped out, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on Roja's peaceful human features. "It is finished," the elder asked, his voice a dry rasp. "The elder is defeated," Cole said, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I ended its path in the canyon, but there was another, a youngling. It escaped." He looked around at the gathered people, his gaze cold and hard. "The month is yours now, the moon. Full, you have the strength. Find the young one, finish what I started, or it will come back for your children's children." The old man nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch, the payment they had agreed upon, and held it out. "Keep it," Cole said, his hand not moving from his side. "Use it to rebuild the barns, buy headstones for the men who didn't survive the night." He turned and walked toward the stable. Duchess was there, her ears pricking up at the sight of him. He saddled her with automatic, mindless movements, his hands working with a memory that had nothing to do with his heart. He didn't look back at the platform. He didn't look at the people who owed him their lives. He just felt the cold, empty space in his chest where the itch used to be. The gift was silent. The fever was gone. He was just a man on a horse, with nowhere to go and all the time in the world to get there. As he rode out of the gate, the sentinel from the first day gave him a long, slow nod. Cole didn't return it. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the road that led away from the mountains and back into the world of men. He knew that the young manticore would grow. He knew it would remember the smell of his blood and the cold bite of his steel. It would become the new legend of these hills, a ghost that would haunt the dreams of the pack for generations. But that was their story now, not his. The Montana sky was a vast, indifferent blue, the kind of sky that sees everything and remembers nothing. Cole rode through the foothills, the scent of pine and sage filling his nostrils, but it didn't feel the same. The world had lost its color. He had loved once for a few brief, frozen days on a mountain, and he had watched that love be extinguished by the very thing he was born to destroy. He reached the main road, a ribbon of black asphalt that stretched toward the horizon. He didn't know which way he would turn. He didn't care. Behind him, the mountains stood like gray tombstones against the morning light, keeping their secrets and their dead. Cole adjusted his hat, feeling the first touch of the autumn wind, a cold wind, a harbinger of the winter to come. He put his heels to Duchess's flanks and moved on. The last hunter, carrying the winter in his heart.